The Alpha King thought he was the perfect father, so I let him prove it. But what does it really mean to be the perfect father? And when someone says, let him prove it, who is truly being tested? If stories about family, love, and unexpected lessons keep you watching until the very end, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what makes someone a truly great father in your eyes? Now, with that question lingering in the air, the story begins where confidence meets a challenge that cannot be answered with words alone. Do not tell me you are a perfect father. Let your child decide that. The music inside Blackthorn Keep filled the magnificent ballroom as nobles, alpha leaders, and honored guests gathered beneath glittering crystal chandeliers to celebrate the 7th birthday of the young royal heir. Long tables overflowed with elegant desserts, polished silverware reflected warm candlelight, and laughter echoed through every corner of the palace. At the center of the celebration stood Alpha King Ethan Blackwood, dressed in a perfectly tailored black ceremonial suit trimmed with silver embroidery. With one hand resting proudly upon his son's shoulder, he smiled as members of the royal council praised both his leadership and his devotion as a father. One elder lifted a crystal glass and declared that no ruler in recent history had balanced the responsibilities of a kingdom and family as successfully as Ethan Blackwood. The compliments spread through the ballroom, followed by polite applause and approving nods. Ethan accepted the admiration with quiet confidence before speaking in a calm voice that carried across the room. He said that every decision he made had always been for his son, that every lesson he taught had prepared the boy for the future, and that no one understood his child better than he did. Near the grand staircase, Claire Bennett listened without interrupting. The white Omega wore a graceful ivory dress, with simple embroidery instead of royal jewels, her chestnut hair resting naturally over one shoulder. She watched her husband with gentle eyes that revealed neither anger nor amusement. She simply observed the confidence in his words. Their son remained beside Ethan, smiling politely whenever another guest greeted him, yet his small fingers quietly twisted the edge of his formal jacket, as though he wished the celebration would end sooner. Claire noticed the gesture immediately because she had seen it countless times before whenever he felt overwhelmed. Ethan did not. He was answering questions from respected guests and thanking influential alpha leaders who praised the future of the kingdom. Claire slowly walked across the polished marble floor until she stood beside them. Every nearby conversation softened as people sensed something important was about to happen. Ethan greeted her with a warm smile, expecting agreement. Instead, Claire looked first at their son before meeting Ethan's eyes. Her voice remained calm, carrying no accusation and no bitterness. You believe you are the perfect father, she said quietly. Ethan answered without hesitation. I have always done everything I believed was best for him. Claire nodded thoughtfully, as though she had expected exactly that response. Then she reached into her small handbag and removed a folded parchment bearing the royal seal. She carefully placed it into Ethan's hand. Then let him decide, she said. For the next 30 days, you will be his only parent.
No advisors.
No servants making choices for you. No one telling you what he needs before he asks. Live beside him. Listen to him. Understand him. Do not convince me that you are a wonderful father. Convince your son. The ballroom became completely silent. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Ethan unfolded the document and realized it was a formal agreement approved by the royal court allowing him to take complete responsibility for every part of their son's daily life for 1 month. He looked toward Claire, expecting to see frustration hidden behind her calm expression, but there was only quiet certainty. She was not challenging his authority. She was offering him an opportunity. Their son slowly looked up at his father with hopeful eyes, waiting for an answer that would matter far more than any speech delivered before the
Kingdom.
Ethan folded the parchment once again, drew a slow breath, and finally smiled with absolute confidence. I accept, he said, believing that 30 days would easily prove what he had always believed about himself. He had no idea that the greatest lesson of his life was about to begin with a promise that no crown could fulfill on its own. The following morning, Ethan Blackwood stood outside the towering gates of Blackthorn Keep with a single leather travel bag resting beside him and his 7-year-old son quietly waiting at his side. For the first time in years, there were no royal attendants surrounding them, no advisors offering carefully prepared schedules, and no servants stepping forward before a request could even be spoken. Claire Bennett had arranged everything exactly as promised. For 30 days, every decision belonged to Ethan alone. She approached them wearing a simple cream-colored traveling coat instead of royal attire, gently adjusted her son's scarf against the cool morning air, and smiled warmly. "Remember," she whispered to the little boy, "this is your father's journey as much as yours." The child nodded before slipping his small hand into Ethan's. Claire looked toward Ethan one last time. There was no warning in her eyes, only quiet encouragement. "Listen more than you speak," she said softly. "He will tell you everything you need to know." With that, she stepped back as their carriage rolled away from the palace. Ethan had already planned every hour of the coming week. He believed structure created confidence, and confidence built character. Their first destination was a beautiful lakeside village where he had reserved the finest guest cottage, complete with carefully selected meals, horseback riding lessons, fishing equipment, and educational activities recommended by royal tutors. Everything had been organized with flawless precision. When they arrived shortly before noon, Ethan proudly opened the cottage door, expecting excitement. Instead, his son quietly looked around before asking, "Can we eat outside?" Ethan smiled politely. "The dining room has already been prepared." The little boy lowered his eyes and simply answered, "Okay." During lunch, Ethan explained proper table manners, healthy nutrition, and the importance of maintaining a disciplined routine. His son listened respectfully while slowly moving vegetables around the plate without taking more than a few bites. Ethan assumed the child simply was not hungry. Later that afternoon, they walked toward the lake where polished wooden boats rested beside a long dock. Ethan had imagined teaching his son advanced fishing techniques learned from experienced hunters. He proudly unpacked expensive equipment crafted by the kingdom's finest artisans. The little boy watched quietly before pointing toward 2 local children skipping flat stones across the water. "Can I play with them instead?" Ethan hesitated. Playing with strangers had not been part of the carefully planned afternoon. Still, remembering Claire's challenge, he nodded. Within minutes, his son was laughing while trying to make small stones bounce across the calm lake. Ethan remained standing nearby, holding the expensive fishing rod that no one had touched. As the sun slowly drifted lower, an elderly fisherman approached with an easy smile. "Your boy has a wonderful laugh," the man said. Ethan smiled proudly. "He is learning discipline." The fisherman chuckled gently. Maybe today he is only learning how to enjoy being 7. Ethan looked across the lake. His son had fallen into the grass after missing another throw, laughing together with the village children as though nothing else in the world mattered. Ethan realized he had never heard that carefree laugh inside the palace. That evening, back inside the cottage, Ethan carefully reviewed the next day's schedule while his son quietly colored pictures beside the fireplace. After several long minutes, the little boy finally looked up and asked, "Dad?" Ethan immediately smiled. "Yes." The child hesitated before speaking so softly that the words almost disappeared into the crackling fire. "Do we always have to follow a schedule?" Ethan looked down at the pages filled with perfectly timed plans before slowly meeting his son's hopeful eyes. For the first time since accepting Claire's challenge, he was no longer certain that every answer had already been written down. The next morning, Ethan folded the neatly written schedule and placed it inside the bottom drawer of the small wooden table without saying a word. His son watched the quiet gesture with curious eyes before slowly smiling for the first time since leaving Blackthorn Keep. Instead of announcing another carefully organized activity, Ethan simply asked, "What would you like to do today?" The little boy looked surprised by the question, as though he had never expected the answer to matter. After thinking for a moment, he pointed toward a grassy hill overlooking the lake where colorful kites floated high above the morning breeze. "Can we make one?" he asked hopefully. Ethan glanced toward the village marketplace. He had never built a kite in his life. Royal craftsmen had always created everything he needed long before he even considered asking. Still, he nodded. Together they walked through the lively market where local shopkeepers greeted them with friendly smiles instead of formal bows. An elderly woman sold bundles of thin wooden sticks, bright cloth, and sturdy string. When Ethan admitted he had no idea how to build a kite, she laughed gently and patiently showed both father and son each step. The little boy eagerly tied small knots while Ethan struggled to keep the wooden frame balanced. Several times the structure collapsed, causing his son to burst into cheerful laughter. Ethan found himself laughing as well, surprised that failure could feel so light instead of embarrassing. Nearly an hour later, their handmade kite finally stood complete, slightly uneven but proudly their own. They carried it to the open hill where steady wind swept across the tall grass. The first attempt ended with the kite falling only a few feet before landing softly on the ground. The second try climbed a little higher before spinning sideways. On the third attempt, the colorful cloth suddenly caught the breeze and rose gracefully into the bright blue sky. The little boy shouted with excitement as he ran across the field, holding the string tightly while Ethan followed close behind. For several joyful minutes, neither of them thought about the palace, royal duties, or the challenge waiting at the end of 30 days. They simply laughed together beneath the open sky. Later that afternoon, they stopped beside a small bakery where the warm scent of fresh cinnamon bread drifted into the street. Ethan ordered the finest pastries available, expecting another pleasant surprise for his son. Instead, the little boy quietly pointed toward a plain apple pie resting near the back shelf. "Mom always buys that one," he said softly. Ethan looked at the simple pie before asking, "Because it is her favorite?" His son shook his head. "Because it is mine. She always remembers." Those 4 words settled gently inside Ethan's heart. He suddenly realized that despite every expensive celebration he had planned through the years, he could not remember his son's favorite dessert. As evening approached, they returned to the lakeside cottage carrying the apple pie together. While setting the table, Ethan noticed a folded drawing resting inside his son's small travel bag. Curious, he picked it up. It showed 3 smiling figures holding hands beneath a bright sun. Claire stood on one side, the little boy stood in the middle, and Ethan stood on the other. Above them, written in careful childish handwriting, were 5 simple words. "I like us together best." Ethan remained silent for a long moment as he looked at the drawing. Then he carefully folded it again and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, closer to his heart than any royal decree he had ever carried, quietly wondering how many precious moments had passed unnoticed while he had been busy trying to become the perfect king instead of learning how to become the father his son had always needed. By the second week, the village no longer saw Ethan Blackwood as the distant alpha king who ruled from behind palace walls. They saw a father carrying a basket of groceries, helping his son choose fresh apples at the market, and laughing quietly whenever flour covered both of their hands inside the small bakery. Every morning became less predictable than the one before. Instead of beginning with carefully measured schedules, Ethan started asking a single question that slowly became their new routine. "What adventure should we have today?" Sometimes the answer was as simple as feeding ducks beside the lake. Other days it meant exploring woodland trails, collecting unusual leaves, or watching birds build nests among towering oak trees. Ethan discovered that his son noticed details he had overlooked for years. The little boy could recognize the sound of different birds, remembered the names of nearly every friendly shopkeeper, and never walked past someone in need without stopping to help. One afternoon, they found an elderly carpenter struggling to carry several wooden boards across a narrow bridge. Before Ethan could offer assistance, his son had already rushed forward and lifted one end with both hands despite the boards being almost too large for him. Ethan quickly stepped beside them, and together they carried the lumber safely into the carpenter's workshop. The grateful old man smiled warmly before handing the little boy a small wooden whistle carved into the shape of a bird. Ethan reached into his pocket, intending to pay for the thoughtful gift, but the carpenter gently shook his head. "Kindness does not always need payment," he said. "Sometimes it only needs another act of kindness." Those words remained with Ethan long after they had left the workshop. That evening, while the little boy slept peacefully beside the fireplace after an active day, Ethan quietly opened the leather journal Claire had packed inside his travel bag without mentioning it. He had assumed it contained emergency instructions or practical reminders. Instead, every page recorded small memories about their son. The first time, he tied his own shoes without help. The afternoon, he insisted on rescuing an injured butterfly by placing it gently among blooming flowers. The rainy day, he proudly baked misshapen cookies because he wanted to surprise his father after an important council meeting, only to discover that Ethan had been called away before returning home. Claire had written every memory with warmth and gratitude, never once blaming Ethan for the moments he had missed. There were no complaints, no bitterness, and no quiet accusations hidden between the pages. Only love. Ethan slowly turned another page and found a sentence written in Claire's graceful handwriting. One day he will ask why his father was not there. I will never let him believe it was because he was not loved. Ethan closed the journal as emotion settled heavily inside his chest. He remembered countless evenings when he had convinced himself that working later, attending another council meeting, or reviewing one more royal report was an act of sacrifice for his family. Claire had never argued against those decisions. She had simply carried every forgotten birthday game, every bedtime story, every school celebration, and every quiet disappointment without asking anyone to notice. The following morning, while preparing breakfast together, Ethan looked across the table at his son spreading apple jam across warm bread with complete concentration. "Has your mother ever spoken badly about me?" he asked carefully. The little boy looked genuinely confused by the question. "No," he answered without hesitation. "She always says you love us very much. She just says that being king makes it harder for you to be home." Ethan lowered his eyes toward his untouched cup of coffee. In that quiet moment, he realized Claire had protected not only their son's heart, but his own reputation as a father, even during the years when he had unknowingly left her to carry the weight of their family almost entirely alone. By the beginning of the third week, Ethan had almost forgotten how many days remained in Claire's challenge because he had stopped counting them. Each sunrise now began with ordinary moments that once would have seemed too small to deserve his attention. He and his son prepared breakfast together, argued playfully about whether pancakes needed more maple syrup, and walked through the village greeting familiar faces who no longer treated him as a distant ruler. For the first time in years, Ethan noticed how slowly a peaceful morning could unfold when no royal schedule demanded every minute of his attention. One bright afternoon, as they returned from the lakeside carrying freshly picked wildflowers, a royal messenger arrived on horseback bearing the silver crest of Blackthorn Keep. The messenger respectfully handed Ethan a sealed letter before riding away, without delay. Ethan broke the royal seal and carefully unfolded the parchment. The message came directly from the High Council. An emergency gathering of every alpha leader had been called in 3 days to discuss new alliances, border agreements, and matters affecting the future of the kingdom. Attendance by the Alpha King was strongly expected. Ethan quietly folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket without saying a word. His son looked up with curious eyes. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Ethan smiled gently. "Nothing we need to worry about today." The little boy nodded before continuing toward the cottage, unaware that the date written inside the letter matched another promise already marked upon the small calendar hanging beside the fireplace. 3 days later, the village elementary school would hold its annual Family Day celebration, and Ethan had promised to spend the entire afternoon there helping his son build a small wooden birdhouse alongside the other families. That evening, while cleaning the table after dinner, Ethan noticed the calendar once again. The colorful drawing his son had made around Family Day covered nearly half the page with bright crayons and uneven stars. Beside the drawing, written in careful childish handwriting, were the words, "Dad is coming." Ethan remained still for several long moments. The following morning, he walked alone beside the quiet lake before sunrise, carrying the unopened council letter in his hand. For years, choosing the kingdom first had never required a second thought. Every sacrifice seemed reasonable because he believed protecting the realm automatically meant protecting his family. Now, standing beside the calm water, he questioned that belief for the first time. An elderly fisherman recognized him and offered a friendly greeting before noticing the thoughtful expression on Ethan's face. Heavy decisions? The old man asked kindly. Ethan nodded. Two promises cannot both be kept. The fisherman looked toward the peaceful village, where children were already beginning their day. Then perhaps the better question is this, he replied. Which promise will someone remember for the rest of their life? Ethan watched gentle ripples spread across the lake as those words settled quietly within him. Later that afternoon, his son carefully gathered pieces of wood, colorful paint, and small brushes for the upcoming school project, speaking excitedly about where they would place the finished birdhouse after bringing it home. Ethan listened closely, realizing that every sentence carried simple expectations rather than impossible demands. The child was not asking for a perfect father. He was only expecting the father who had promised to be there. As evening arrived, Ethan returned to the cottage, unfolded the council letter once more, and calmly wrote his reply beneath the royal seal. He respectfully informed the High Council that the Alpha King would not attend the gathering because he had already made a commitment that could not be postponed. When the messenger departed carrying the sealed response back toward Blackthorn Keep, Ethan stood quietly on the front porch watching the rider disappear beyond the distant hills, understanding that for the first time in his reign, the most important decision he had made as king had been inspired by learning how to become the father his son had quietly believed he could always be. Family Day arrived beneath a brilliant blue sky, and the small village school overflowed with laughter long before the first activity began. Colorful ribbons hung from white fences, wooden tables displayed paintbrushes and craft supplies, and children hurried across the grassy playground with endless excitement. Ethan Blackwood walked beside his son carrying a simple box filled with wooden boards, small nails, paint, and brushes for the birdhouse they had promised to build together. No royal guards surrounded them. No ceremonial announcements marked the arrival of the Alpha King. To everyone gathered there, they looked like an ordinary father and son beginning an ordinary Saturday morning. The little boy reached for Ethan's hand without hesitation as they entered the schoolyard together. That single gesture carried more meaning than any title Ethan had ever received. Throughout the morning they measured pieces of wood, laughed when one side of the tiny birdhouse refused to fit correctly, and accepted cheerful advice from neighboring families who had built similar projects before. Ethan admitted he had never held a carpenter's hammer for anything other than ceremonial occasions, causing several parents to laugh kindly before showing him a simpler technique. His son smiled proudly each time his father learned something new instead of pretending to know everything already. When the birdhouse finally stood complete, although slightly crooked and decorated with uneven blue paint, the little boy looked at it as though it were the greatest masterpiece in the world. He carefully wrote both of their names beneath a small painted sun before holding the birdhouse close to his chest. "This is our house," he said with quiet happiness. Ethan felt his heart grow unexpectedly warm. During the afternoon picnic, children played games across the open field while parents rested beneath large oak trees. Ethan and his son shared slices of homemade apple pie from the village bakery, talking about birds, fishing, kites, and everything they wanted to do before returning home. There was no schedule waiting for them, no urgent meeting, and no distant responsibility pulling Ethan's attention away from the conversation happening directly in front of him. As the celebration slowly came to an end, the little boy tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve. "Can we walk home instead of taking the carriage?" he asked. Ethan smiled. "Of course." They followed a quiet dirt path lined with wildflowers glowing beneath the gentle afternoon sun. Birds sang from nearby trees while a soft breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the rolling hills. Halfway home, the little boy suddenly stopped walking. Ethan turned with quiet concern, wondering whether his son had become tired. Instead, the child stepped closer, reached for Ethan's hand once again, and looked up with bright eyes filled with complete sincerity. "Dad," he said softly, "this has been my favorite month ever." Ethan felt emotion rise inside him before he could answer. The little boy continued with a shy smile that seemed almost too precious for words. "I always knew you loved me. I just did not know you liked spending time with me." Those gentle words settled deeply inside Ethan's heart, revealing a truth he had never imagined. Love had never been the question. Presence had been. Ethan slowly knelt until they were looking at one another face to face. His voice became quiet with honesty. "I am so sorry that it took me this long to understand." The little boy wrapped both arms around his father without saying another word. Ethan returned the embrace, holding his son close beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, realizing that every victory he had celebrated as Alpha King suddenly seemed smaller than this simple moment. As they continued walking home side by side with the little birdhouse swinging gently between them, Ethan understood that becoming a great father had never been about proving himself right. It had always been about showing up, listening carefully, keeping his promises, and choosing his family every single day. When the 30 days finally came to an end, Ethan Blackwood and his son returned through the towering gates of Blackthorn, keep beneath the soft glow of an autumn afternoon. The palace looked exactly as Ethan had left it, with polished marble courtyards, silver banners dancing gently in the breeze, and royal guards standing proudly at every entrance. Yet everything felt different because he was no longer seeing the kingdom through the eyes of an Alpha King alone. He was seeing it through the eyes of a father who had finally learned what had been missing all along. Their son carried the slightly crooked blue birdhouse carefully against his chest, as though it were the greatest treasure in the world. Servants smiled warmly as they welcomed the family home, but Ethan noticed something he had overlooked for years. His son greeted every servant by name, asking about their families, remembering small conversations from months before, and making each person feel important. Ethan quietly realized that kindness like this had not come from royal lessons. It had come from Claire. She was waiting for them in the palace garden beside a bed of blooming white roses, wearing a simple ivory dress that moved gently in the afternoon breeze. When their son saw her, he ran forward with joyful excitement before proudly placing the little birdhouse into her hands. "Dad and I built it together," he said with a smile so bright that it softened every corner of the quiet garden. Claire admired the uneven paint, the slightly tilted roof, and the carefully written names beneath the small blue sun. "It is beautiful," she whispered sincerely. "I have never seen a better birdhouse." The little boy laughed happily before asking if they could hang it beside the old oak tree overlooking the garden. As he hurried away to find the perfect branch, Ethan and Claire remained standing together beneath the warm sunlight. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer carried distance. It carried understanding. Ethan slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the folded drawing their son had made beside the fireplace weeks earlier. He handed it to Claire, without saying a word. She recognized it instantly and smiled softly.
"He drew this months ago," she said.
Ethan nodded. "I know." His voice became quieter than she had ever heard before. "I thought providing everything meant I was giving him everything. I was wrong." Claire looked at him carefully, saying nothing, allowing him to continue in his own time. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before meeting hers again. "You never turned him against me," he said. "Even when I missed birthdays, bedtime stories, school events, and ordinary afternoons, you protected the image he had of his father instead of protecting yourself." Claire gently folded the drawing. "Children should never carry the weight of their parents' disappointments," she answered. "He deserved to love both of us without choosing sides." Ethan felt those words settle deeply inside his heart. For years he had believed leadership meant always having the answers. Claire had quietly shown him that real strength often began with listening instead. He drew a slow breath before speaking once more. "Tomorrow the Royal Council has gathered every noble family in the Grand Hall.
I
have something I need to say." Claire studied his expression and saw no trace of the proud king who had accepted her challenge 30 days earlier. In his place stood a husband who had learned humility and a father who finally understood presence. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Then speak with the same honesty you found beside that lake," she said gently. Ethan watched his son laughing beneath the old oak tree while carefully hanging the little blue birdhouse among the branches, and for the first time in many years, he felt completely prepared for the words that would matter far more than any royal decree he had ever delivered. The following morning, the grand hall of Blackthorn Keep filled with alpha leaders, noble families, trusted advisors, and respected elders from across the kingdom. Sunlight streamed through towering stained glass windows, casting warm colors across the polished stone floor as quiet conversations echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Everyone expected King Ethan Blackwood to address the matters he had missed during the emergency council meeting weeks before. Instead, when he stepped onto the raised platform, his first words surprised every person in the room. "Today I am not here to speak about alliances, trade, or the strength of our kingdom," he began calmly. "I am here to speak about the greatest failure of my own life." Silence settled across the hall. Ethan looked toward Claire, who stood quietly beside their son near the front of the gathering. Then he faced the crowd once more. "For many years, I believed that providing everything my family needed was the same as being present for them. I believed that every sacrifice I made for the kingdom automatically became a sacrifice for my wife and my child. I was wrong." The honesty in his voice carried through every corner of the chamber. 30 days ago, Claire challenged me to spend 1 month raising our son without servants, advisors, or anyone else standing between us. I accepted because I believed I already understood what it meant to be a father. Ethan paused briefly before continuing. "I returned home realizing that I understood leadership far better than love." The room remained completely still. Several council members lowered their eyes, recognizing parts of their own lives within his words. Ethan turned toward Claire with quiet respect. "There is another truth this kingdom deserves to hear. During every year that I was absent, Claire never once spoke against me to our son. She protected my place in his heart even when I did not earn that kindness. She carried the weight of our family with grace, while allowing me to believe I was carrying it alone. Everything our son has become is because of the love, patience, and character she gave him every single day." Claire stood motionless, clearly unprepared for such public recognition. Ethan stepped down from the platform and stopped only a few feet in front of her. Before the entire kingdom, the Alpha King gently bowed his head. Gasps quietly spread through the hall because no one could remember another king offering such a gesture outside the oldest royal ceremonies. Ethan lifted his eyes to meet Claire's. "I cannot erase the years I missed," he said softly. "I cannot ask you to pretend they never happened, but I can tell the truth. You taught me what fatherhood truly means. You succeeded where I failed. Thank you for refusing to let our son grow up without hope." Their son looked from one parent to the other, smiling with quiet pride. Claire remained silent for a long moment before answering gently. "Words matter," she said, "but children believe actions." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Then I will spend the rest of my life proving these words." Claire did not step forward. She did not embrace him. She did not offer immediate forgiveness simply because he had spoken beautifully before the kingdom. Instead, she gave him a small, thoughtful smile that carried both caution and possibility. Ethan understood completely. Trust that had taken years to weaken would not return in a single afternoon. As the gathering slowly came to an end, many noble families left the grand hall speaking less about royal politics and more about the courage it had taken for their king to admit his mistakes publicly. Ethan walked beside Claire and their son through the palace gardens without expecting anything more than the chance to continue walking beside them, grateful that rebuilding a family, like becoming a father, would now be measured one faithful day at a time rather than by promises alone. 1 year later, the spring festival transformed Blackthorn Keep into a celebration of color, music, and laughter that reached far beyond the palace walls. Families from every village gathered inside the royal gardens where flowering trees stretched across the hills and thousands of white blossoms drifted gently through the warm afternoon air. Children chased one another between bright ribbons tied to ancient oak trees while musicians filled the open fields with joyful melodies. The festival had always been a grand tradition, but this year the atmosphere felt different because the kingdom itself had changed in quiet ways. Inspired by their king's public confession, many alpha families had begun setting aside 1 day each week with no council meetings, no official ceremonies, and no unnecessary duties, choosing instead to spend uninterrupted time with their children. Ethan never claimed credit for the change. He simply continued living the lesson he had learned. As the celebration unfolded, the familiar blue birdhouse still hung proudly from the old oak tree in the palace garden. Though the paint had faded slightly beneath changing seasons, small birds had built a nest inside, returning every spring as though reminding the family that love also needed a place where it could safely grow. Ethan stood beneath the tree beside Claire, watching their son, now 8 years old, laughing with friends while carefully helping younger children paint tiny wooden birdhouses of their own. Without being asked, he patiently encouraged every child who made a mistake, reminding them that crooked walls could still protect happy birds. Ethan smiled quietly because those words sounded remarkably familiar. Claire noticed the expression on his face. "He learns by watching," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I know. That is why I try to give him something worth remembering every day." Claire looked at him for a long moment before gently slipping her hand into his. It was not a dramatic gesture. There were no speeches, no promises, and no audience waiting to applaud. It was simply the natural result of countless ordinary mornings, shared meals, bedtime stories, school events, quiet walks, and promises faithfully kept throughout an entire year. Trust had not returned because Ethan asked for forgiveness. It had returned because he never stopped earning it. Their son suddenly ran toward them carrying 3 freshly baked apple pies balanced carefully on a wooden tray. "I remembered everybody's favorite," he said proudly. Ethan laughed warmly as Claire smiled with quiet amusement. Together they spread a blanket beneath the old oak tree and shared the simple dessert while watching the festival continue around them. Nearby, several young fathers played catch with their children instead of discussing politics, while mothers rested beneath blooming trees without carrying every family responsibility alone. Ethan looked across the joyful gathering and realized that leadership was no longer measured only by strong borders or prosperous harvests. It was also measured by the families who returned home feeling seen, valued, and loved. As the golden light of evening settled across the gardens, the master of ceremonies invited the Alpha King to offer the traditional closing blessing. Ethan stepped forward, looking first toward Claire and their son before facing the kingdom. His voice carried calm gratitude instead of royal pride. The greatest strength any leader can possess is not the power to command others. It is the humility to love the people waiting for him at home. A kingdom becomes stronger when its families become stronger, and children remember our presence far longer than our achievements. Warm applause spread across the gardens, but Ethan's attention remained on the 2 people smiling back at him beneath the flowering oak tree. 1 year earlier, he had believed becoming the perfect father meant having every answer. Now he understood that the greatest gift a father could ever give was simply showing up with an open heart, day after day, and because of that quiet lesson, the Alpha King was remembered not as the ruler who claimed to be the perfect father, but as the man who became one by choosing his family every single day.